Down in the basement at Pearl, the air tasted like coffee gone cold and sweat that never left. Station HYPO wasn't glamorous. It was rows of desks, hand-sorted intercepts, and heads bent over 5-digit groups that read like nonsense. JN-25, Japan's Navy General Operational Code, was supposed to be unbreakable. It wasn't a single cipher. It was a layered system. Codebook values turned into numbers, then salted with additives that kept changing. Every change flipped the table. Every flip erased months of work. But HYPO kept crawling back. Not with magic, with method. Traffic analysis mapped who spoke to whom and how often. Call signs shifted, but patterns leaked intent. A sudden surge of high-level messages to carriers. Logistics chatter-heavy in the central Pacific nets. Fragmentary decrypts, verbs without objects, coordinates without names, still told a story if you laid them side by side and refused to blink. By April, they could pull pieces within hours of transmission. Not enough to read minds. Enough to sense momentum. One group kept recurring like a drumbeat, AF. It appeared next to warnings about fuel, references to seaplane tenders, and updates about weather sectors that pointed uncomfortably toward the Central Ocean. If AF was Midway, that meant a major thrust right at a tiny atoll barely large enough to matter. If AF was Midway, then someone wanted them to think it was. Skeptics said Japanese planners loved feints. The Aleutians hung like bait to the north. Washington's analysts weren't all convinced. Betting a fleet on a hunch could end a war the wrong way. Inside HYPO, the arguments got sharp. Commander Joseph Rochefort, robe over his uniform and slippers on his feet, listened to his team run the math. AF wasn't a hunch to them. It was the only location that fit the total pattern. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, carried that assessment upstairs, calm voice, tired eyes. He could show volume, timelines, and probabilities, but not certainty. And certainty was what admirals prefer when ships are on the line. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the raw intercept logs, where the strings hinted at a grid reconstruction. HYPO analysts had begun to sketch the Japanese area designators back onto the Pacific like a ghost map. Each intercept placed a faint pin, the outline that emerged centered on Midway Square. Still, doubts held. A mistake here would send Enterprise and Hornet into thin air and leave Midway ringed by enemies without help. So they decided to force the issue. The plan was simple, almost crude. Make Midway complain about fresh water in the clear. If the Japanese then referenced AF having a water shortage inside JN-25 traffic, the circle would close. The risk wasn't just that the ruse might fail. If the Japanese smelled bait, they could alter plans or, worse, change the code additives again and erase HYPO's fragile gains. Nimitz allowed it anyway. Trust had to be tested to be useful. On Midway, the message went out. The desalination plant was down. The island needed fresh water. No code, no encryption, just a routine-sounding report that any listening post would hear and pass along. Then the waiting began. 2 days stretched like 2 months. HYPO sifted new intercepts, teased out familiar 5-digit clusters, and pushed slips across tables to the language team. Everyone pretended to be casual. No one was. Then it landed. A Japanese encrypted message reported that AF was experiencing water shortages. The phrase popped in translation like a flare. AF low on water. It wasn't poetry. It was proof. Layton took it straight to Nimitz. The Admiral listened, nodded once, and didn't need it repeated. AF equaled Midway. The enemy carriers would move for it on a schedule HYPO had bracketed to early June, with the key warning arriving in late May. This was the moment everything changed. With the target fixed, the problem became geometry and time. But down in HYPO, the relief was tempered. Breaking JN-25 wasn't a one-time victory. The additives were still in motion. Each day might steal or return clarity. The team kept building cribs, predicted phrases that could pin numbers to meanings, and they kept feeding the fleet with partials. Only a small portion was readable, but the flow of even that portion created a pulse of intelligence the Navy had never had. It wasn't that they could read every Japanese secret. It was that they could read enough, fast enough, to act first. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese planning assumed silence equaled safety. Their doctrine counted on operational security, and on the sheer mass of their carrier air groups to crush any response. What they didn't know at the time was that traffic volume itself betrayed scale. Hypo watched it rise, dipped into pieces, the names of escorting ships, hints about ordnance loads, and kept the Aleutian question on the table but subordinate. Pattern said Midway. Proof said Midway. Now, a decision would move metal. Human moments kept the room honest. A yeoman dropped a stack of punch cards. Everyone froze because one card misfiled meant a chain of errors. A linguist, eyes bloodshot, turned, fueling into food on a first pass and caught it on the second, heart pounding at what an error like that could do. Rochefort, amused and exhausted, told them to go home at midnight, and no one left. They argued for weeks that the data would be enough if Command believed the data. Now Command did. In the aftermath of the ruse, the Japanese didn't slam the door on JN-25. They tightened, they shifted, but they still had to talk to sail a fleet. That was Hypo's quiet advantage. The ocean forced radio. Radio created footprints, and footprints, however faint, left a trail if you had the patience to trace it. The trail pointed to a rendezvous near Midway, carriers attached, timing predictable within a narrow window. This was intelligence turning into position. And with AF no longer a ghost, Nimitz could gamble with eyes half open. Nimitz's gamble, ambush geometry. The message with AF low on water hit Nimitz's desk and turned doubt into a deadline. Geometry took over. Where would 4 carriers be if they intended to strike at dawn? How far could they run each night to launch at first light? He spread charts, not to admire them, but to trap a fleet inside a box they couldn't see. The ambush wouldn't be set at Midway's shoreline. It would be laid northeast, out where the horizon hid steel and the ocean masked intent. He ordered Enterprise and Hornet to steam from Pearl, radios tight, emissions low, every signal a breadcrumb dennied. Yorktown was the impossible piece. She'd been mauled at Coral Sea. By any sane standard, she needed months. Nimitz gave her 3 days. In dry dock, welders worked around the clock, patching flight deck, rigging boilers, marking off compartments that would stay flooded and sealed. He didn't pretend she was whole. He just needed her air group and her speed. A shipyard foreman signed off with grease on his shirt and disbelief in his eyes. Yorktown slipped out, paint still drying, damage control drilled as if their lives depended on repetition, because they did. Fuel became a quiet tyrant. To meet the enemy at a point nobody had fought over yet, he needed precise burn rates, tanker rendezvous plotted by the hour, and wiggle room for bad weather or a rogue contact. Oilers staged and faded. Destroyers throttled back to SIP, then sprinted to rejoin screens. Task instructions hardened. Maintain radio silence, accept gaps, trust scouting lines to talk for you. PBY Catalinas fanned out, clawing miles of ocean with searchlights at dawn, eyes at the edge of their fuel curves. A thin net for a fast opponent. Meanwhile, he used the one tool that could slow an unseen approach: submarines. Old boats, many too slow to chase carriers, were still good as pickets. He placed them like nails on invisible fence lines west of Midway. If even one sighting got through, the fleet would have a bearing. If a torpedo found a hull, so much the better. Mostly, they would be tripwires, pressure the enemy without exposing the ambush. Orders went down with a clarity that hid the anxiety behind them. Enterprise and Hornet pushed to point luck. Hold northeast of Midway, conserve strength, strike on contact. It sounded simple. It was. The ocean is a liar. Squalls hide ships. Bearings drift. Pilots fly long legs over an empty map and start believing the map is wrong. Nimitz asked them to wait where the enemy would be, not where it felt safe to wait. He knew the map, but he also knew the politics. If he misread Hypo by even a day, the Aleutians might be hit for real, Washington would scream, and his carriers could be caught in the open by a force that still outgunned them. He signed anyway. Leighton briefed him again. Timing window, intended routes, the oddity of Japanese scouting plans, a gap in sectors where no one should have left one. That seam mattered. Japanese doctrine was superb, but rigid. Perfect on paper, exposed under pressure. Across the ocean, Nagumo sailed confident. His crews rehearsed set-piece cycles. Launch, recover, rearm, relaunch. His search plan assumed surprise. His air defense assumed any American interference would be piecemeal and late. He didn't know the Americans would already be to his northeast, just outside of what he expected to see. On the American decks, the human moments wrote the risk into muscle. A radio man stared at a silent set and fought the urge to ask for news. Pilots traced lines with pencils and drew small excess where they'd ditch if fuel ran out. A chief petty officer taped a lucky charm to a dive bomber's panel and pretended not to believe in it. Yorktown's engineers ran drills to isolate damage and keep steam up even if bombs walked her decks. The Admiral's staff calculated recovery cycles, how many planes in the air, how many minutes until decks had to be clear, how long to swap torpedoes for bombs if the target set shifted in midair. The ambush wasn't just a place, it was a sequence. PBYs at long range to fix first contact. Midway's land-based strikes to harass and force Nagumo to keep defensive CAP low and busy. Carriers held tight until the Japanese decks were caught in the worst state. Rearming, refueling, hoses unreeled, bombs stacked and fuses handled. If timing slipped, the window closed. If timing aligned, 11 minutes would be enough. Nimitz's gamble had a logic that didn't comfort anyone trying to sleep. He would let the enemy strike midway, because striking early might expose his carriers. He would rely on HYPO's brackets, June 4 early morning, because there wasn't anything better to rely on. He would count on the Japanese to stay within their own doctrine, because doctrine is hardest to abandon under fire. And he would trust that his pilots, scattered by cloud and error, could still find an enemy that didn't know it was being hunted. By June 2, the trap was set in silence. Submarines watched empty seas, then reported wakes in the wrong places. PBYs wrote coordinates that looked like guesswork until the same patterns surfaced twice. A Catalina at night skimmed low and sighted silhouettes where HYPO's pins said they should be. The report crackled in, multiple ships, course and speed. Bearings tightened. The box shrank. On June 3, Midway's garrison braced. In the carrier flag plots, grease pencils moved on plexiglass. Enterprise and Hornet held their nerve northeast, beyond the arc of early detection. Yorktown took station with them, her patched skin masking a hard truth. One good hit could end her. Nimitz's map showed converging lines on a point that didn't exist to the naked eye. That's what intelligence buys, the confidence to be where sight can't yet justify you. The ocean still looked empty. That was the point. Inside Kido Butai, Doctrine and blind spots. Before dawn, the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu glowed under work lamps. Crews moved like a choreographed machine. Ordnance trains clanked, fuel hoses snaked, armorers checked fuses with quick taps. This was the world's most refined carrier arm, and it ran on precision and repetition. At approximately 4:30, Nagumo's order moved down the ladders, launched the Midway strike. Bombers rolled, Zeros leapt after them, and the first act began exactly on time. The doctrine was elegant. Hit land first to strip defenses, hold a reserve armed for ships in case American carriers appeared, keep the combat air patrol, CAP, rotating to side down anything that slipped through. But there was one problem. Doctrine assumes you see what you need to see. Nagumo's search plan assigned scout planes to radiating sectors, but delays crept in maintenance snags, catapult hiccups, a float plane crew scrambling to replace a fouled plug. One scout launched late, and another missed a slice of the horizon nobody expected to matter. On paper, it was a minor variance. At sea, it left a seam. Meanwhile, the air striking Midway drew flak and grit. Anti-aircraft bursts stitched the sky. Some Japanese pilots returned reporting hangars hit, fuel tanks aflame, but runways still usable. The report that mattered for Nagumo wasn't glory. It was the line that said a second strike might be required. He faced the doctrine's fork. Keep the reserve armed with torpedoes for ships you hadn't found yet, or rearm for another land strike to finish Midway quickly. He hesitated, then leaned toward rearming. Below deck, the machine shifted. Ordnance crews turned to the dance nobody outside their ranks truly understands. Torpedoes were unshackled, wheeled back, cradles cleared. Bombs came forward. It wasn't instant. Fuses came in sealed tins. Armorers opened, inspected, fitted. Fuel crews spooled hoses, primed pumps, checked vents. The decks and hangars became a forest of potential energy. Explosives stacked. gasoline fumes rising in confined air, men moving quickly because the clock never stops in a carrier fight. They'd practiced this cycle until it felt inevitable. Above that rhythm, the CAP fought an unglamorous war. Early contacts, Midway's B-26s coming in low, B-17s high and scattered, forced the Zeros down then up, never quite where a perfect plan would place them. Each scramble dragged minutes off the top of Nagumo's decision window, and every time a formation headed home, the carriers had to recover, spot, and clear the decks before they could relaunch more scouts or push a fresh strike. Efficiency can harden into rigidity. The cycles had to complete. At 70, the late scout finally radioed what Doctrine didn't plan for enemy ships. The message was clipped and maddening, ships sighted, bearing and distance. No types, no count of carriers. A heartbeat later, a correction, possibly a carrier. This was the moment everything changed, not in explosions, but in choices. Nagumo's reserve, in the middle of rearming for a second land strike, suddenly needed torpedoes again. The order reversed. Crews cursed under their breath and hauled heavy steel the other way. That reversal multiplied risk. Bombs already on dollies had to be moved back. Some went to magazines. Some stayed temporarily staged because time was now the enemy. Fuses half-fitted required careful unfitting. Fuel lines, once unrolled, take minutes to stow safely. Some stayed slung. Speed, not tidiness, drives wartime decks. The Doctrine's strength, tight control over cycles, was now an exposed nerve. And the CAP, still busy at lower altitudes, swatting torpedo planes and level bombers from Midway, wasn't stacked high to watch distant horizons. Unknown to them across the ocean's haze, American scouts were groping toward these moving pieces, often off headings, often alone. But inside Kido Butai, the confidence held. They had weather, training, and the belief that surprise still belonged to them. Nagumo weighed another option, launch what he had, some planes fueled, some bombed for land targets. Against a carrier he couldn't yet see clearly. Doctrine argued against a piecemeal strike. He waited for a more coherent blow. Those minutes would haunt him, because minutes were all he had. Human moments threaded through the steel. A petty officer down in Kaga's hangar wiped sweat and fuel from his hands and grinned at a joke he didn't hear fully. A Zero pilot, mask off between scrambles, sipped water and stared at a slice of sky where nothing moved. A flight deck officer, whistle between his teeth, kept men clear of prop arcs while counting in his head how long until the next recovery. They weren't careless. They were busy, and busy looks like danger if an enemy arrives at the wrong time. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the scout net. A sector to the northeast, lightly covered, held silence longer than it should have. The late takeoff had stretched a search leg just enough to leave a blank wedge. It was small on a chart. It was enormous when measured against the speed of carriers and the reach of dive bombers about to wander into fate. That blind spot wasn't sabotage. It was friction. By mid-morning, the machine on Kido Butai's decks was mid-cycle, neither ready to strike nor clean to defend. It was the kind of vulnerability that exists only for a narrow slice of time, then closes like a fist. And just as the fist began to tighten, the clouds to the northeast started to thin. Contact lost, failures, near misses, and grit. While that seam widened in Nagumo's search, the American side started bleeding minutes. At dawn, a PBY clawed low over grey water and radioed. Multiple ships, course west-southwest. Bearings were rough, but good enough to trigger launch boards. Then static chewed the follow-up. A correction came in late, shifted by a few degrees, and a single misheard digit turned a clean vector into an argument on a plotting table. Hornet's Air Group launched on a heading that looked bold on paper and became infamous by noon. This was the flight to nowhere. Hornet's dive bombers and their fighter escort, led by Commander Stanhope, held to the briefed course, stayed high, and searched empty ocean. Fuel ticked down. Morale did too. Below them, the Earth's curve hid the carriers by a handful of miles and minutes. They didn't know that a slight dogleg to the right would have put the Kido Butai on their noses. Doctrine said stick to the plan. The plan didn't know about a late scout and a small wedge of sky masking a fleet. Meanwhile, Midway's garrison threw everything with wings. B-26s ran in at mast height, with torpedoes slung under bellies that weren't built for wave-top flying. The first pair found the Japanese carriers and bored in. Zeros dropped like knives. A B-26 took hits, staggered, and aimed straight at Akagi's bridge, so close that men on deck flinched and ducked before it cartwheeled past the island and into the sea. B-17s, high and steady, released strings of bombs that walked wakes but found no decks. It wasn't precision, it was harassment, and it pulled the CAP down, then up, then down again. Across the American carriers, radio discipline fought human impulse. Pilots who saw smoke wanted to talk, commanders wanted silence. A spot report from a submarine hinted at a course line that didn't match the morning's PBY reading. The plot thickened, literally,